All right. So, kind of thinking about some of those questions, thinking about some of our perhaps responsibilities to the environment, to non-human animals, we are going to jump into Callicott's argument, again starting on page 279. The Intrinsic Value of Nature and Public Policy, the Case for the Endangered Species Act by J. Baird Callicott. And essentially, and in environmental philosophy, there's often been a discussion on two distinctions of instrumental value and intrinsic value. And we've seen these creep up a couple of times throughout the semester, but he's going to use them as it relates to, environmental ethics. Okay? And he writes, first opening paragraph, the distinction between instrumental and intrinsic value is both familiar and venerable in Western ethical thinking. In familiar and venerable Western ethical thinking, however, the only beings to believe to have intrinsic value are the only ones worthy of being valued intrinsically are human beings. Beginning in the 1970s, there's a new breed of environmental philosophers that sought to build a case or cases for the intrinsic value of some non-human natural entities or nature as a whole, in order to ethically enfranchise non-human beings. Okay? And so what he's going to start to do is he's going to start to reference this distinction in environmental ethics, which is between intrinsic value and instrumental value, and insofar as how we can indeed make a case for nature, for non-human species, non-human beings, having intrinsic value. Okay? So he's got some definitional work to do here of talking about what is instrumental value, what is intrinsic value, and working through that. I'm going to skip the next paragraph, and so the last paragraph on the bottom of 279 he writes as follows. He says, I will not here recapitulate the many and various philosophical cases for the intrinsic value of nature. Rather, I consider a signal public policy document based implicitly on the intrinsic value of nature, the Endangered Species Act of 1973. Now, this is interesting. So he's using a public policy. He's using a law that was passed by in a bipartisan way by Congress. Right? So he's using a very political piece of legislation, right, in a philosophical way, which I think is kind of a clever move, right? Where when we hear about various animals that have been put on the ESA, the bald eagle, the buffalo, various animals that we don't have any idea they're on the ESA but are on the ESA, that it is a policy piece of legislation that many people came together to work on and is in the public sphere. Okay? And so to use and to advance his argument for the intrinsic value of nature, he is going to use this piece of legislation to do so. Okay? He writes, nowhere in the ESA is the intrinsic value of threatened and endangered species ever mentioned. So the idea that those words intrinsic value are never mentioned in the ESA, which makes it even more philosophically and argumentatively difficult for him to make this conclusion, to make this argument, right? Because if the words are never used, then you have to do a lot of inference. Nowhere in the ESA is the intrinsic value of threatened and endangered species ever mentioned. So, he writes, one important task for me is to show that the ESA does indeed implicitly affirm the intrinsic value of threatened and endangered species, and two, how we value things instrumentally or intrinsically does make a big practical difference. And that second kind of point there, the second point of how we value things instrumentally or intrinsically does make a big practical difference. There's the other side of the debate that says it doesn't matter if we value things intrinsically or instrumentally. It just doesn't matter. Okay? Callicott thinks that it does matter, and I think he might be onto something. Okay? So now he goes to define intrinsic and instrumental value. And this is on the top of 280. The value of something as a means to an end other than itself is instrumental. The value of something for itself, for its own sake, as an end in itself is intrinsic. Okay? And in particular, we saw this distinction when we talked about Kant. Okay? That for Immanuel Kant, remember the second formulation of the categorical imperative, where the second formulation of the categorical imperative stated that we are to treat others as never simply as a means toward an end, but always as an end in themselves. This idea that when we think about how we engage with one another, how we treat each other ethically and morally, we do so in such a way where we recognize each other's humanity, we recognize each other's intrinsic worth, right? And we treat each other accordingly, where we don't just treat others as a means. We don't just use other people, right? Because to use something is to use it as an instrument. So instrumentality, using something instrumentally, is to use something, okay, as a means towards an end. And granted, we do have a means-end relationship, right? We discussed this where I am using you all to get money, I don't know, and you all are using me to advance your collegiate career, right? So we definitely have a use-type relationship, but if you or I were to only think of each other solely in that context and not kind of accept or recognize that we are fully functional and autonomous rational beings, then we are using each other simply as a means, right? And that, for Kant, is unethical. And so Caldecott is kind of drawing up that distinction as well. Okay. And he says, a little coffee for the morning here. He says, to bring out the difference between instrumental and intrinsic value in the context of the endangered species, consider the following anecdote. Edwin P. Pister is a now retired associate fishery biologist with the California Department of Fish and Game. He worked long and hard to save from extinction several species of desert fishes living in small islands of water in an ocean of dry land. Okay. Insofar as again, this idea that working out in the desert, that there are little pockets of ponds, little pockets of lakes, and in those pockets of ponds and lakes, there were these tiny little fishes that lived out there. Okay. And he worked long and hard to save from extinction several species of desert fishes living in small islands of water and an ocean of dry land. Pister was often asked, not by laypersons, not only by laypersons, but also by members of his own department, what good are these kind of pup fishes anyway? This idea that what good are these fishes in these desert lakes that you and I have never seen, probably will never see, what good are they? Right? What good are they? He tried in vain to answer seriously such a smug, essentially rhetorical question by saying that while such fishes may be of little value instrumentally, they are nonetheless intrinsically valuable. Okay? So the idea that these fishes aren't doing anything, right? They're certainly not affecting my life, arguably, in Moscow, Idaho. They're certainly not affecting your life in Moscow, Idaho, right? But to the extent that they still, Mr. Pister, which is fun to say, they are claimed to have intrinsic value. Right? Perhaps for mere existence, perhaps just being a living entity, perhaps existing, right? Maybe that is the key for intrinsic value, maybe. And then the paragraph continues a little bit in the last sentence here. Ultimately, he, Mr. Pister, hit on a simple, effective, and dramatic means of getting the questioner to grasp the value distinction that otherwise discursively articulating. He answered the question with one of his own, what good are you? And so when we think about kind of our own value, right, I would argue, and many other that are in this kind of conversation, think this kind of way, right? What good are you? What is our value? How do we understand our own value? Is it placed to us by others? Is it placed to us by our parents, by our society, by the groups we belong to? Or do we have value kind of in and of itself? Are we intrinsically valuable? It's an interesting question, right? That, I am instrumental in not only teaching, but at the wine shop, in my various friendships and various relationships. I'm instrumental in various enterprises that I partake with on a day-after-day basis, right? So there is instrumental value to my existence, undoubtedly. There's instrumental value to your existence as well. But to the extent that, is there something deeper, right? Something that's more difficult to explain, more difficult to understand, as it relates to kind of intrinsic value, a value in and of itself. And then Caldecott continues, most of us hope to be some use to others and to be responsible contributing members of society, okay, in the instrumental sense. But when age or infirmity reduces our instrumental value, to a degree approaching zero, we expect others and society to acknowledge our intrinsic value. Thus, we do not simply dispose of one another when the time comes, as we do with other things that are valued solely instrumentally, such as broken tools, junk cars, and withered houseplants. And so the definition that he's now going to give for intrinsic value is as follows, and this is on the last paragraph above the section break on 280. Therefore, we can think of an entity's intrinsic value as the value that remains when all its instrumental value has been subtracted. Hence, in academic environmental philosophy, in ethics, intrinsic value is often equated with non-instrumental value. I'm not particularly interested in the second sentence there, but the first one, therefore we can think of an entity's intrinsic value as the value that remains when all instrumental value has been subtracted. Okay? So when we think about young children, like infants, right? And again, this, I don't mean for it to sound rude or disrespectful, but frankly, like, they're not doing anything, right? But nevertheless, they are valuable, right? And why are they valuable? They're valuable intrinsically. They make us not only feel something, I guess that is kind of instrumental, but also when we see an infant, when we see or engage with somebody that's near the end of their life, right, where they seem to not be possessing much instrumental value, they're still nonetheless valuable, right? And what is that value that we're kind of thinking about and acknowledging? It's intrinsic value. Okay? So I'm going to stop this video just because I get a little wary of going over 10 minutes with these things just because I don't know how they upload and whatnot. So I'm going to pause this, and then there will be about one more 10-minute video to kind of advance Callicott's argument. And so thinking about intrinsic value, thinking about how intrinsic value is the value that remains when all instrumentality is subtracted.